In this chapter, we will discuss about architecture components in details. The Android architecture components are a set of open source libraries that were created by Google to help developers create robust, maintainable apps for the Android platform. They were originally released in 2017 at the Google I/O conference. They have been used extensively in many commercial apps since then. Prior to the introduction of these components, there were many different recommendations for architecting Android apps based on various design patterns, such as MVC or MVVM. These architecture components are not the only way to put your Android app together, but they are a good way and they have official support from Google. If you build an Android app without using any sort of architecture, you end up with what are sometimes known as God activities. Activities where all the code is in a single place. And this is true whether you are just using activities or some combination of activities and fragments. The result of not architecting your apps is that your classes can become very large and cumbersome and is very difficult to maintain. The code becomes very complex and there are many dependencies between different layers of the code. The result for an app with many features is that it becomes fragile. You build up what is sometimes known as technical debt, and the app gets to a point where you don't want to add any more new features because it is too easy to introduce bugs. The solution is to break up your app into pieces. In an app that architected with the architecture components, the activities and fragments representing the visual user interface only have code that affects the presentation. All of your business logic and any code that goes to managing data in memory is stored in something called a view model. Each activity or fragment has its own view model, and the view model persists between configuration changes, so you don't have to deal with lifecycle events as much. Then, to work with the data, you wrap the data in something called a live data object. The live data object is a publisher and it can be subscribed to from the presentation layer. So, whenever there are changes in the data, those changes are published and then presentation layer reacts. The database is managed then with Room library. The Room library is designed to work with the Mu model and the live data components, but can also be used on its own. Here is how the components related to each other. First of all, you have your activities and fragments, your presentation layer. Each activity or fragment has its own view model, and the view model is where you store your data in memory wrapped in live object. The view model then talks to a class called repository. A repository is not one of the architecture components, but it represents a very strongly felt best practice. The purpose of the repository is to have one place that knows where your data actually is. And when the data is stored locally, the repository can work with the Room library, which in turns work with SQLite database. Or if you are working with remote data, you can use Retrofit library and talk to web services. So the activities and fragments only have presentation code. They only know how to show the user what the user needs to see and handle UI events. The view model knows about the data, but doesn't know how it is being used by the activities and fragments, and it doesn't know where the data is coming from. The repository knows where the data is coming from, but not how it is going to be used. And the Room library and the Retrofit libraries are responsible for acquiring and modifying the data, but don't know anything about the rest of the application. Again, this is the philosophy of separation of concerns, and it results in small, maintainable components. When you need to make a change in one component, you are far less likely to introduce bugs in another. There are other useful components that are a part of architecture components that I am not covering in this course. One of them is called Lifecycle Owner. These components allow you to delegate lifecycle event handling, such as the common boilerplate code event handling methods, into their own separate class. The paging library is a part of the Room architecture, and it allows you to page through large data sets, and the data binding library lets you build complex user interfaces without having a lot of boilerplate view references code and explicit assignment of values to views. Just because these components exist doesn't mean you have to use them. These components are designed to make your app better, more robust, and easier to maintain, but there is a cost, both in learning curve and in initial development time. So you should decide for yourself, for your particular app, which of these components are going to make your job easier, both for initial development and long-term maintenance.